Hello, everyone. Thank you, everyone, for attending today. We are about to start. If you want to leave in the chat, where are you from and from where are you watching us? We are happy to have you all here. We have Tracy with us today talking about creative financing subject 2 versus wrap mortgages. And we are super happy to have her with us today. So feel free to use the chat box and the Q&A box to ask Tracy all the questions that you may have during the webinar, so she's able to answer them as soon as possible. And again, feel free to let us know from where you're watching this webinar so we get to know you better. So we are Real Estate IQ. Your deal is our mission, and we are deal maker and dream maker. And we provide the best real estate solutions, committed to help one more person to win. So make your deals come true. Thank you, Ashley, for sharing. So we have Ashley for Bay Area, California. So as I said, we are Real Estate IQ. This is the streamline your deal making process. These are the solutions that we provide. So we offer off-market leads. We provide daily updated lists, Monday to Friday, of motivated sellers to contact. Get the freshest data mined straight from the card houses. We also offer EVA CMA. So run real estate comps in seconds with our renewed CMA. You can check each property's data, select the ones to compare, and get reports instantly. We also offer custom leads mining. So if you're looking for specific area leads, look no further. We now provide custom off-market data mining all over 50 states. And we also offer virtual assistants. So one solution for administrative tasks, customer service, and technical support to grow your business. So let's walk together toward your success. If you're looking for more, please try our exclusive membership. These are our social media accounts where you can follow us as well. We are in Instagram, in Facebook, in LinkedIn, and in YouTube. And you can use the QR codes that appear below of each icon so you can join us in our community. And you can also use the QR code that appears on the right side of the screen so you can join us in our newsletter so you don't miss any of our weekly webinars and in-person events. Thank you, everyone, for sharing. Thank you, Felix. We have people from LA, Bay Area, California. Thank you, everyone. We also offer free 30-minute in-depth consultation of Real Estate IQ services with one of our experts. So feel free to schedule it now by scanning the QR code that appears on the screen, or also by answering the poll that should appear on your screen as well. This is a very short video of what we do. Okay, I don't want to make you lose more time. Thank you everybody for attending. I will move forward to you, Tracy. I will stop sharing my screen now. And if you don't mind also answering another poll, so we know if you would like to have a free demonstration of our tools. And now, Tracy, you can start with your amazing webinar. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much. I appreciate that. Well, I'm excited to be here today. We're going to talk about a topic that is very timely. You've been probably hearing a lot about it. And you might be wondering, why are we hearing so much about subject twos and wraps? And maybe subject two is a term you've heard, and maybe wrap is a new term. Or maybe you've just wondered what in the world is the difference and how does it apply to me? And so we're here to talk about that and how it applies to note investors, because that's what I have done for the last 30 years. I have been a real estate note investor. So I got my start back in 1988 when I went to work for a company that bought seller financed notes. So when people make a loan or use seller financing and they're receiving payments, they might want to sell that loan. And that's what a note investor does. But real estate investors and note investors and wholesalers and finders, all of that goes hand in hand. And so we're going to talk today about one specific segment of the market, and that is the subject to, or sub two, as you might have heard about it, and the wraparound mortgage note. Now, what we're planning on covering today is what really is the difference between subject to versus a wrap note. And what are the pros and cons of using wraps? Because if you read the intro or the marketing pieces, I have strong opinions that I like wraps better than subject twos. So I'm going to tell you why that is in this presentation. Hope to bring you over to see it from my perspective. How do we minimize risk to buyers and sellers? Because you might be buying, you might be selling, you might be doing both. And so there are certain risks that come into play with subject to and wrap notes. So how do we minimize those? And one of those risks is the due on sale clause. So what about that? And how do we deal with that? And then I will give you my 10 tips for using wraps successfully. And then we'll do a case study because it's always fun to apply this to something that is in real life, right? So I am not an attorney or a tax advisor or a financial advisor. All of this is based on experience that I've done for over 30 years. And so I always encourage people to use the services of a legal, accounting, or investment advisor. So just keep that in mind as we go through this presentation, because you're definitely going to want to work with an attorney. So what are we going to talk about today? Well, we are going to talk about Sam the seller, who owes money to a bank and he wants to sell his property. And we're going to talk about Barb the buyer, who has options of how to buy that property. She can buy from Sam the seller traditionally by paying all cash or going out and getting her own bank loan. And in that situation, when Sam the seller sells to Barb the buyer, that money that comes into closing will pay off Sam the seller's bank loan. Or he could sell it subject to Barb the buyer. And so that loan, that first position bank loan, would stay there. And when you sell subject to, then Sam the seller deeds it to Barb the buyer, and Barb the buyer makes payments to the bank. That's subject to. Or you could wrap the whole thing with seller financing, where Sam the seller sells to Barb the buyer, the first lien stays, but he uses a second set of paperwork known as a note and mortgage or note and deed of trust, depending on your state. Barb the buyer makes payments to Sam the seller, and Sam the seller makes payments to the bank. Now, we'll delve into these more, I promise, but I kind of wanted to set the stage because the other day I was talking to a group of real estate investors. It was actually about 800 real estate investors up at the Ohio RIA. Now, if you're wondering, I'm located here in Florida, but we do business around the United States. And I was speaking to a group of real estate investors in Ohio at the Real Estate Investors Association there. And I said to someone, I said, just think of a subject to and a wrap. Think of a wrap is like a subject to, but with more paperwork. And they said, I like that. I can wrap my arms around that. And so we'll talk today about why that paperwork is very important. So just to lay the foundation, if Sam the seller sells to Barb the buyer on subject to, that's a type of creating financing that leaves Sam the seller's existing debt in place. And seller financing with a wrap is also creative financing. It also leaves the existing debt in place, but it wraps it all up in a set of seller financing documents. So you'll see we'll be comparing subject to or sub to and the wrap notes. Now, today I could have used a wrap like a sandwich wrap. I could have used a wrap like a taco, or I could, but I'm using a wrap like wrapping a present, because when I look at wrap mortgages, I think of them as a present, as something very special that we get to use as real estate investors. So I consider subject to creative financing, but not seller financing. Wraps are actual seller financing, and seller financing is part of a market that was 22.5 billion with a B dollars in 2022, over 123 billion dollars in the last 5 years. And we track these stats because we're always curious about seller financing, and it happens all across the United States, but there are certain states. These top 10 states actually make up almost 70% of the seller finance volume. And Texas, year after year, has always been #1 for seller financing, where Sam the seller sells to Barb the buyer and allows Barb the buyer to make payments to him instead of getting a bank loan. So that's what we're talking about here when we talk about seller financing or seller carryback. Now, not all seller financing or seller carrybacks involve wrap mortgages where Sam the seller still owes money. Sometimes Sam the seller might owe it free and clear and finance it for Barb the buyer. But wraps involve where Sam the seller still owes money to that bank. And that is certainly a percentage of this seller carryback market. Now, when we look at seller financing over the last 10 plus years, it really was booming after the subprime mortgage meltdown because so many banks pulled out of the market. And then after the financing came back normally, we see that we sort of leveled off with seller financing. But right now, we're seeing an increase in subject to seller financing and wrap mortgages. Well, why is that? Why do you want to know about this now? Well, in case you haven't noticed, interest rates have gone up. In fact, they went up 500 basis points. That's 5%. So from say 3 to almost 8 in 15 months. Because what's happening is that in an attempt to fight inflation and all the money that got pumped into the market and all the prices going up, the Fed has increased the federal lending rate, and that has a trickle-down effect to mortgage rates. And so US mortgage rates have soared to their highest in more than 23 years, and it happened fast. It happened quickly. So we have all this debt out there that sellers or homeowners have at 4%, 3%, 2.75%. I'm one of those lucky ones who was able to get 2.75%. We have all this existing low interest rate debt, and now we have a new high interest rate market. And so that is why so many people are talking about how do we do subject to a wraps where we can take advantage of that low interest rate debt, and you do that in a high interest rate environment. So before we get into examples, I really want to make sure we understand what is the power of these variety of interest rates. So think about the interest rate impact on payments. Let's say we've got a $160,000 note or mortgage or deed of trust, $160,000 loan. If somebody was lucky enough to get an interest rate of 3% 2 years ago, their payment to pay that off in 30 years would only be $674.57. That $160,000 loan at 6%, still paying off in 30 years, 360 payments, that monthly payment's going to go to $959.28. So their payment went up by $284.71 from what it was at 3%. If you can sell or carry at a 10% rate, which is very common, we see sell or carry paper at 10% rates, and the payment for 30 years would be $1,404.11. That's $729.54 more than the payment at 3%. So you can just see the variety of how that happens. So if you are buying a property subject to, and you had to go out and get a loan at 6%, you can see why you would want to buy it subject to, and keep the seller's loan at 3%, because just that difference in payments, almost $300. That could be the difference between a rental property cash flowing for an investor. That could be the difference between, being able to afford taxes and insurance and different things like that. So this is the reason people are so excited to buy subject to. I say we buy wrap leaving that in place, and I'll explain to you why. And when you wrap, you can buy subject to with a wrap, and then you can sell with a wrap. And that's when you could do something cool if you were able to buy with a wrap and then sell with a wrap, if you wrapped around 3% debt and you could sell a 10% debt, just on the same 160,000, you could create a cash flow of $729.54. So I just want to make sure before we start going through any of these numbers or pros and cons that you understand, why do people even care about using subject to or wraps? And it's because they want to take advantage of that low interest rate debt that's out there. We're in a unique time when the rates now are much higher than they were a couple of years ago. Now, as I mentioned, I've been doing notes since 1988. Do you think I knew a little bit about high interest rate rates in the 80s? Absolutely. I think that's the last time they were higher than what they are right now. So some of these strategies have always worked, but they work especially well in a time where the current interest rates are high and we are coming out of a time where they were low. So remember, we're going to compare the two approaches. Subject to, where Sam the seller sells to Barb the buyer, gives her a deed. He just is out of the transaction and he trusts Barb the buyer to make the payments to his bank. Wrap notes is where the same thing happens, but they use seller financing, and Sam the seller has some unique privileges to stay in the transaction. So let's just go back through this. What is a subject to transaction? All right, Sam the seller owes money to the bank. He sells to Barb the buyer, gives her a deed. The existing bank loan stays. Barb the buyer pays the bank loan because Sam the seller's out of the transaction. If Sam the seller has equity in that subject to transaction, Barb the buyer is either going to need to bring it in cash, or she's going to have to get a lender who's willing to stay behind that first bank loan, because Sam the seller's bank loan is in first position lien and it stays that way. So that is a standard subject to. This has so many problems that can happen. Let's say that Sam the seller sells to Barb the buyer and Barb the buyer doesn't make the payments to the bank loan. Well, Sam the seller is the one who's legally obligated on there. So now he's supposed to owe the bank, but he doesn't have any interest in the property. That's problem number one. Problem number two could be that the bank calls the loan due because, as we'll talk about, there's something called a due on sale clause. And again, Sam the seller doesn't have any way to enforce to make Barb the buyer do what she promised to do in that subject to transaction. And that's the true reason I like a wrap note better. So a wrap note is just a little bit different. The seller still owes money to a bank. The seller sells to the buyer with owner financing. The existing bank loan still stays, but here's where the difference is. That seller financing documentation has Barb the buyer pay Sam the seller, and Sam the seller is the one who pays his bank. Yes, the bank is still in first position, but Sam the seller has a second position junior lien, which is called the wraparound note. It wraps around. So you got the bank loan here at the core. If you think of a Tootsie Pop roll, you think of that in the middle. And then you think of the candy around that wraps around it. Or if you think of a present in a box and then you put the wrapping paper around it, that's basically where that term came. It wraps around it. So that mortgage between Sam the seller and Barb the buyer wraps around that bank loan. And that is really the difference, because now Sam the seller, if Barb the buyer doesn't make her payments, he still has an interest as a junior lien holder. He can foreclose on Barb the buyer. He also controls that those payments continue to stay current with the bank. And doesn't that seem fair, since his name's still on the bank loan, is obligated to make those payments? It also gives you some really great opportunities, because Barb the buyer does now have to bring in all the cash to closing if Sam the seller has equity. Sam the seller can actually finance some of that equity for Barb the buyer as well. So all of those are reasons that I really, really like a wrap note over the subject to. So I say these things a couple of different ways because I think laying it out helps people see the difference. So let's just line up the pros and cons right next to each other on the slide. Subject to, the seller still owes the bank. Wrap note, seller still owes the bank. Subject to, the seller deeds to the buyer. Wrap note, seller deeds to the buyer, but remember with some extra paperwork. The bank stays in first position, both on a subject to and a wrap. But on a subject to, the seller has no remaining interest. They just give that deed and they get nothing back. They don't get a wrap note. So they have no remaining interest in the property, but they still have that obligation to the first position. On a wrap note, a wrap transaction, the seller has a second position wrap. They have a note and mortgage interest. So now they have something they receive from Barb the buyer that they use to pay their obligation to the bank. In the subject to, the buyer pays the bank loan that Sam the seller still owes. In a wrap note, the buyer pays the seller and the seller pays the bank loan. And we'll see how we minimize that risk when we follow the 10 rules of a wrap note. So let's look at a transaction. I actually see, I'm going to take a brief pause here and I'm going to take a peek at the chat. I'll kind of pop in and out of the chat. So let me just see the chat. All right, so Cece said, but then the buyer can pay the seller, but the seller may not necessarily make payments. Yeah, excellent point, Cece. So that is a risk in a wrap note, and that's why I'm going to show you in my 10 rules for wraps how we avoid that potential problem. I am so glad that you brought that up. So you're definitely thinking ahead on that. All right, so this is how wrap notes work. Let's look at a transaction with some numbers. Sam the seller has a property for sale. We're back to our example. Sam the seller owes the bank. He owes the bank $47,260. He has a 4% rate. He's not quite as lucky to have 2.75, but there's a lot of those out there. But Sam the seller owes the bank and he has a 4% rate. His payment is $341.35. And he's paid a while on that loan. He's owned it for about 15 years, so he has about 186 payments left on that loan to the bank. These are real live numbers, did not make these numbers up. This is a real transaction that we worked with in Dallas, Texas. And so Sam the seller decided to sell that property to Barb the buyer. So right now, before he sold the property, he's making $341.35 to his bank. We'll call him Wells Fargo. And Barb the buyer comes in and wants to buy this property. Well, we're going to have Barb the buyer buy it from Sam the seller using a wrap transaction. So this is going to seller finance at $100,000 sale price with a $20,000 down payment. And Barb the buyer now owes Sam the seller $80,000. On this $80,000 wrap seller finance deal, Barb is going to pay 9.75% interest. Her payments will be $758.81. And she is amortizing out at 20 years. They could have done it at 30 years, but on this transaction, they did it at 20 years. There's 20 years left. So she sends her $758.81 to Sam the seller on this wraparound note mortgage. And Sam the seller sends his $341.35 to the bank. And they stay in first lien, and Sam the seller has a second wraparound. So what happens is Sam the seller walks with the $20,000 down. He is going to net $417.46 for 186 months. Now, where did we get $417.46? Remember, Barb the buyer's paying him $758.81. He's paying the bank $341.35. So you take $758 minus $341. He's netting $417.46 every month until the bank loan pays off. Then when the bank loan pays off, Barb still owes on her note. She'll still have 54 payments out of the 240 left. And Sam the seller will collect that whole $758.81. So that is one way a wraparound could work. Now, these terms could be different between Sam the seller and Barb the buyer. What terms can't be different is what Sam the seller owes the bank, right? That's already happened. But at the time of negotiation, these terms between Sam and Barb can be negotiated. So pros and cons of a wraparound note. One pro is that it's easy for the buyer to qualify. It's very easy closing. You can use existing financing and you can create interest income and interest spread. So we looked at that transaction and we saw where Sam the seller charged a higher interest rate than what he was paying the bank and how he made the spread, the difference in there. He also financed some of the equity he had. And so he had made money on the transaction in the real estate, but he continued to make it by getting that nice interest rate on the equity and getting the spread between the first and the second. Now, if Barb the buyer had enough money to bring in the cash, the difference between the 100,000 and what Sam the seller owed, he could have just sold to her with a wraparound with terms that exactly mirrored his bank loan to Wells Fargo. He could have financed her at 3.75 and the same payment amount. So just keep in mind, there's all different ways to do these transactions. But a wraparound note still has a con to it that a subject to also has, and that is that first position bank loan at Wells Fargo has the right, but not the obligation to call it due on sale. So that is something we have to discuss. There's also a default risk. If Barb the buyer doesn't pay Sam the seller, he's still got to make sure he pays the bank. There are insurance coverage issues. That's one of the most challenging things with wraps, and we'll talk more about that. And I'll be honest, wraparounds are a little bit complicated when it comes to documentation, escrows, first bank loans, buyers paying seller, seller paying bank. And there are risks to the seller and there are risks to the buyer. And these are very important risks to acknowledge and disclose. And that's why we're going to talk about them here. The risk to the seller is still obligated to bank. It's not a formal assumption. Barb the buyer doesn't assume that loan. So the seller still signed the promissory note. They have not been let off the hook. So the bank can look to the seller for payment, or they can take the property back. If Sam the seller ever gets his credit pulled while the bank loan is still there, it's going to show on his credit report. That means if Sam the seller goes to get any other bank loans, it's going to show as a debt that he owes. The beauty, though, of a wrap mortgage is he also gets to offset that debt he owes by the income that he's getting in on that wrap mortgage. It could be that the buyer, Barb the buyer, defaults, and so Sam the seller has to foreclose on her on his junior wraparound mortgage, all the time keeping that bank loan current. And during that time, if Barb the buyer didn't make her payment, Sam the seller is going to have to come out of pocket to maintain that first to be current. And again, there is a due on sale clause risk to Sam the seller that bank will say it's all due now and payable. I promise we're going to get to talking about how to deal with that. Now, Barb the buyer has risks too, as Cece pointed out in the chat. The very first biggest risk to Barb the buyer is Sam the seller doesn't use her $750 payment to take his money out and pay that underlying first. Barb the buyer also has the risk that if Sam the seller filed bankruptcy or passed away and had an estate, that she's going to have to deal with that. She might have troubles getting any information on that first position owed to Wells Fargo because she isn't recognized as the legal borrower on there. Sam the seller is. If there is an insurance claim on the property for fire or hazard, it gets very complicated. Who gets that insurance money? Who's really insured? And we'll talk about how to deal with these risks in my 10 tips. And Barb the buyer also has the risk that first mortgage could call it due on sale. Then both her and Sam the seller have to figure out what to do to make that bank happy. So let's talk about the elephant in the room with subject tos and wraps. That is the due on sale clause. So what is it? It's language written into a deed of trust or a mortgage that is called in legal terms an alienation and acceleration clause. This is a typical one that you might see in paperwork. It says that if there is a transfer of the property or a beneficial interest in the borrower, and remember, this is Sam the seller who signed this bank loan with Wells Fargo, so this is probably in his paperwork to the bank. It says that if that is transferred, then by bond for deed, contract for deed, installment sales contract, escrow agreement, a deed, or any intent to transfer the title by the borrower at a future date to a purchaser. So basically it's saying that they have the right to call it due on sale. So if all or part of the property or any interest in the property is sold or transferred, all right, without the lender's prior written consent, the lender may require immediate payment in full of all sums secured by the security instrument. However, this option shall not be exercised by lender if it's somehow prohibited by law. It's just a catch-all phrase. If lender exercises this option, lender shall give a borrower notice of acceleration, meaning the whole thing's due, the whole balance is due. The notice shall provide a period of not less than 30 days from the date of the notice is given to the borrower, and the borrower must pay all sums secured by the security instrument. If the borrower fails to make these sums prior to the date of that period, lender may invoke any remedies permitted, and that usually is foreclosure. So most due on sale say that the lender has the right, but not the obligation to call it due if the ownership is transferred. They have to give notice of invoking that. Then if it's not paid off, then they can go to foreclosure. Now, how long does foreclosure take? That depends on the laws of each individual state. Most states start, like there's a 90-day default they can file, and then there's 180, and then depending on your state, it can take longer than that. But that's usually the quickest. Like Texas is one of the quickest foreclosures. It's hard to get it done because of the statute, the laws of the state that govern foreclosure in less than 180 days. So that gives some additional time to get in there and figure out a solution. But in the meantime, interest and penalties are accruing. So due on sale clauses. I've been doing this for 30 years, and I probably heard about 5 or 6 times where the lender called it due for just the due on sale clause. The most common reasons lenders call notes and mortgages due is because people get behind on their payments or their taxes, or they let their insurance lapse. So one thing to remember about this, it's a right but not an obligation. So keeping the first current on a subject to or a wrap is paramount. You have to keep the first position current. That's the main reason bank loans get called due, is because somebody doesn't pay the principal and interest payment. You also have to plan for the worst case scenario. If the bank called it due, what are the outs? What are the exit strategies? How could you pay that off? So Barb the buyer could maybe go out and get refinancing, pay off Sam the seller. Sam the seller could pay off the bank loan. Maybe Sam the seller could sell his wraparound mortgage to a note investor like me, and out of proceeds will pay off that bank loan. Maybe he can negotiate with the bank. There's a couple of ways that you can plan for the worst case scenario. Maybe they can get additional second position financing enough to take out the bank loan behind the wraparound note. So all of those are the ways that you can deal with a due on sale clause. Now, I say no, we haven't seen very many due on sale clause exercised just for transferring of interest. However, I think we're starting to see it more. And part of the reason I think we're starting to see it more is because we're in this low interest rate environment, and banks would much rather get their money back out on the street at 6, 7, 8% than keep it at 3, 4%. I also think a lot of people are doing these incorrectly, and they are not keeping that first current. And they are not keeping the insurance accurate, and they're not keeping taxes current. And so that will always trigger a bank to take action. And I think a lot of people aren't doing them correctly, using subject twos and not wraps. And that is leading to that problem. So a lot of people say, oh, if you use a trust, that won't trigger the due on sale. As you can see from that alienation clause we read, it said even if it was a transfer of a beneficial interest in a trust. Now, I do agree that putting trusts in there give it a layer of protection that may not make it so obvious to the banks that it was transferred to Barb the buyer. There are pros and cons to using a trust, and your attorney can tell you what is best for your state, but it does not 100% get rid of that due on sale clause risk. Please know that. So If all of that scares you and you have no interest in a wrap because you cannot get away from the fear of the first calling it due, that's okay. Wraparounds and subject twos are not for you. There's lots of other ways to make money in real estate. So I'm not here to say, oh, there's no risk. I'm saying, how do we identify the risk? How do we mitigate the risk? And what kind of tips and strategies can we deploy so that we help minimize that and we make it win-win for Barb the buyer and Sam the seller? Because I've been Barb the buyer and I've been Sam the seller, and I think everybody should be treated fairly and be protected in this situation, which is part of why I like a wrap over a subject too. It doesn't play to one side or the other. Everybody gets fairly protected. So here are my 10 tips for wraps. Number one, I'm going to go through these kind of quick. And then because I want to get to an example and a couple things, but number one, always create interest rate spread. I think the wrap note rate should be higher than the underlying bank. More is better, but 2 to 4% is a good minimum. So for example, if the first was 4, then the wrap should be at least 6 to 8%. Use this spread between the two interest rates to create profit, to arbitrage. Always consider the term length. This is when the first might pay off before the wrap. So if amortizing, the underlying first should not go longer than the wrap. So we don't want Sam the seller to still owe money to Wells Fargo and Barb the buyer's already paid him off. So we really want to make sure that wrap goes as long or longer than the first. If there's a balloon on the underlying, meaning that Sam the seller owes a big chunk at the end, and that could happen if it was an investor type loan. Doesn't happen so much on owner occupant loans, but a balloon could definitely happen on investor loan. Then that wrap term should also become all in due. Personally, I like to avoid balloons whenever possible because of something called Dodd-Frank Act. And if the homeowner is going to live in the property, there's certain do's and don'ts for balloons. So most of the time it's easier just not to use them. But if your underlying first had one, then you need to think about that on the wrap. And then just compare maturity dates. So when does Barb the buyer pay off Sam the seller? And when does Sam the seller pay off the bank? And will everybody get paid off at the same time? Tip number 3, payment coverage. The wrap payment should always cover the underlying with room to spare. So Barb the buyer needs to be paying Sam the seller more than what Sam the seller owes to the bank. You don't want Sam the seller to have to come out of pocket every month because there might be a month he doesn't do that. Not a good situation. And as you're going to learn, I recommend you always use a third-party servicer for these. So you've got to factor in the fee that the servicer charges, which is on average $25 to $30 a month. If there are unusual terms, you need to align them. So you don't see this as much, but we sometimes see a prepayment penalty at the bank. There might be adjustable rates. There might be balloon payments we already mentioned. So just think about those because you always want to make sure that that payment that's coming in from Barb is sufficient to make the payment to the underlying bank loan. And then consider tip number 5, the whole payment that's due to the bank loan. Not only there's there probably principal and interest, there's probably reserves for taxes, 1/12 the tax bill. There's probably reserves for insurance, 1/12 the property insurance. And there might even be private mortgage insurance that is owed. So consider the whole payment amount, making sure there's enough coming in to cover that whole payment amount. Tip number 6 is to set up a third-party servicing company to make the disbursements. So this goes directly to the question Cece asked, what protects Barb the buyer from sending her payment to Sam the seller and he doesn't send his piece to the bank? Bad, bad, bad. That's a bad situation. So you set up a third-party servicer that Barb the buyer makes payments to. And that third-party servicer will collect that payment from Barb the buyer. They will deduct the amount automatically that Sam the seller owns to the bank and send that payment off to the bank. And they will include any pass-throughs for taxes and insurance for escrows. And they will do an annual accounting of the first and the wrap. And they will send the difference then to Sam the seller. So that amount that Sam the seller netted. So this protects Barb the buyer, this protects Sam the seller, this provides for proper disclosures, this makes sure that the bank loan gets paid. But I believe in going one more step to keep that bank loan current. I always want it to be paid ahead. I know it takes time for Barb the buyer to mail her payment to the servicer and the servicer to send the payment to the bank. I know that takes time if it's the mail or ACH or direct deposit or just processing time, clearing, bank clearing time, all those sorts of things. So I always front load one payment to that bank. So when Barb the buyer is making a payment on her wrap, it's not paying that month payment to Wells Fargo. It's paying a future payment to Wells Fargo. So I always front load any wrap deal I do, one payment to Wells Fargo. And I always make sure the wrap at a minimum payment due is 2 weeks prior to the first. I still think that's cutting it too close. So I always like to front load one payment to Wells Fargo ahead of time. And then it's always paid ahead. And so I think that is one of the easiest ways to make sure it's always paid ahead and you're not sweating. Oh, did Barb the buyer make her payment on time? Is it a little bit late? Oh no. Is it getting late at Wells Fargo? Because if it's late at Wells Fargo, that's going to be a ding on Sam the seller's credit. And we know that's the number one reason due on sale clauses get triggered is because payments aren't kept current. But what happens if the due on sale clause gets triggered? Well, you always need to have a backup plan. That is tip number 8. So what are some of our backup plans? Well, Sam the seller could assign or sell the wrap note to a note investor like me. We mentioned that. And out of proceeds, I would pay off that underlying debt. And now Barb the buyer would make payments to the servicer, which would make payments to me. And there's no more underlying to Wells Fargo. Barb the buyer could refinance and pay off her debt to Sam the seller in full. And from that, Sam the seller would pay off the Wells Fargo debt. And now Barb the buyer would make payments to the new lender. And there are other options out there too. Maybe you could do a collateral assignment, a substitution of collateral, put the loan on a different property. You could have junior financing, anything that could get that bank loan paid off. Tip number 9 for wraps, make full disclosure. The risk of the due on sale clause needs to be told to the buyer, Barb the buyer. Barb the buyer needs to have rights if the seller defaults on the underlying. So if they take that payment and don't pay the underlying. Most good wrap documents say if for some reason that happens, Barb the buyer can make payments direct and deduct it from what she owes Sam the seller. But you and I know we're not going to have to do that because we're going to use that third-party servicer, that tip we already talked about, to make sure that doesn't happen. The seller also has to have rights if Barb the buyer defaults, and that's all spelled out in the wraparound mortgage or deed of trust. And there also has to be full disclosure of what happens in the event of probate or bankruptcy by Barb the seller or Barb the buyer or Sam the seller. And one more thing that comes down to disclosures is know your state laws about this. For example, Texas in January of 2022 implemented Finance Code 159. That code in the statute for Texas specifically only talks about wraparound mortgages. So if you're saying, oh, those aren't legal, guess what? They are. They actually have statute in Texas to say what should happen. And you know what? All the things I talked about in these 10 tips, they're part of the statute in Texas. Some states don't have statute yet, but I predict with all the subject to and the wraps happening, some states will implement statute that follows probably what Texas does. Other states like California, you might have heard of an all-inclusive trust deed, AITD. That's another word for wraparound mortgage, and they have special language they use there. Arizona has it. Oregon, Washington, a lot of those states that you saw were the top 10 for seller financing have already dealt with this because wraps are very popular in seller financing. Now, the bad news is I think subject twos are going to give wraps a bad rap. Sorry, I didn't really mean to say that, but I think they're going to give wraps a bad name. And I think subject twos, more than wraps, are going to bring about in the future some different kinds of legislation. Because what's happening on the subject twos is they're not making proper disclosure. They're not telling Sam the seller that he still owes Bank of America and that it's going to show up on his credit. We see subject twos not giving Sam the seller any rights. And remember, a wraparound mortgage keeps Sam the seller with the same rights as a lender, just in junior position to that first. And tip number 10, use the right paperwork. This is where your attorney who understands wraps in your state is going to help you. And maybe it's a title company. A lot of title companies do closings in states like California and Washington, Oregon. So there's a special addendum to the purchase contract that's going to be in the deed. There's going to be a wraparound note. There's going to be a wraparound mortgage or deed of trust, sometimes called an all-inclusive deed of trust. There's going to be a wraparound agreement that lays all this out in writing. And you always want to involve a knowledgeable attorney, not just any attorney, not somebody who just has never done a wrap before, but somebody who does wraps day in and day out. And this is just a sample of an addendum that addresses the all-inclusive wraparound deed of trust and how it actually lays out the underlying note and who owes what. So just to show that there are forms out there that attorneys use for this. Other considerations that a lot of people use, and your attorney will discuss the pros and cons, but if you're buying on a wrap note, maybe Barb the buyer would like the ability to check on the bank loan to Wells Fargo. And so maybe Sam the seller could give her permission or rights to be able to check on that. In some states, a contract for deed is used instead of a wraparound mortgage. Texas, it is not. It really is state specific, but that's another potential depending on your state. States like Michigan and Iowa use a lot of contract for deeds in these situations. Some attorneys will suggest that you use an LLC entity or a trust entity. Some suggest to use a trust entity that's owned by an LLC, putting in all these different layers. And that can be pros and cons to that as well. And then there's also paperwork if you're using seller financing and it involves a buyer that's going to live in the property, things that apply to the Dodd-Frank Act, the SAFE Act. And it's always great to use an MLO, which stands for a mortgage loan originator. Even though we're dealing with seller financing, if you use an MLO, they can make sure all the right disclosures and the right paperwork are also used. For the wraparound side, you're going to need to be sure to use an attorney, but an MLO can help with qualifying the buyer under Dodd-Frank and the SAFE Act. And again, I don't know, I keep putting it in here, always involve a knowledgeable attorney when you're doing these deals. So if you're going to wrap like a pro, you've got to think about other creative leveraging. So you might hear these terms when you start talking about wraps. So I just want to bring them up. You might hear of a mirror wrap. A mirror wrap says that the terms between Barb, the buyer, and Sam, the seller, are going to mirror the terms to Wells Fargo. That usually happens when Barb, the buyer, cashes out any equity Sam the seller has. That's usually when you see that, when Barb the buyer would get to take advantage of that low interest rate. Sometimes you'll hear the term double wrap. What does that mean? Well, that's where Sam the seller wrapped his bank loan to Barb the buyer. Now Barb the buyer is going to sell to another buyer, and she's going to wrap her note with Sam the seller, which wrapped the bank loan. And you'll see a double wrap if you see somebody say, I'm going to do a subject to and then wrap it. If you were going to do, I don't like subject twos, I want to do a wrap, then you could do a wrap instead of a subject to, and then when you sell, you could wrap that. And that's what a double wrap is, two different wraps. You could buy subject to and then wrap that. I like a double wrap better because remember, I'm trying to get you away from subject twos. Sometimes we'll see that there's a split note, one for the down payment or the real estate commission, in addition to what Barb the buyer owes Sam the seller. So creativity abounds in wrap situations. And then know what your options are if you're buying or selling a wrap note. So remember I said if the due on sale clause got called, Sam the seller has this wrap note to Barb the buyer. Well, he could contact a note buyer like me and say, hey, I need to sell off this wrap note Barb the buyer's paying me on so that I can pay off my loan to Wells Fargo. And he might just want to do that proactively. Maybe he's going out to get a bank loan and he wants that showed paid off on his credit report. So when I get approached to buy these wrap mortgages, and a lot of the ones that I buy that are seller financing, the seller still owes money. I can pay off that underlying first from proceeds. That's one option. That's the most common option. When I buy the wrap note, I'll pay off Wells Fargo. I have to deduct that from what I pay Sam the seller because that's his debt. Or I can keep it as a wrap and just collect the net cash flow. Now, I'm going to give you an example of that 2 ways. This is called the Lone Star wrap because this is that deal in Texas. This was actually a different deal. It had a sales price of $68,000 with an $8,000 down payment, and it had a seller finance drop of $60,000 at 9.5%. This one had a payment of $559.28. And there was an additional $346.67 paid for taxes and insurance. So the total PITI payment was $905.95. That would be the wrap note between Barb the buyer and Sam the seller in the example, keeping with the people. Sam the seller still owed money to an underlying first lien. He owed $46,443 at 6.5%. He owed $423.30 in principal to that bank. He also owed the same $346.67 for taxes and insurance. His total payment was $769.97. So that had an original balance of $66,970, but it had paid down to $46,443. So this is the time they came to us. This has already been paying for a while, both the wrap note and the bank loan when we were approached to buy the note. So at this point in time, and actually this one was one of our members. This is one of their deal. And they bought it to me and they said, what should I do on this deal? And I said, well, you have 2 choices. You can pay off the underlying or you can keep it as a wrap. So this is an example of that specific wraparound deed of trust. This one was in Texas, and you can see that it specifically talks about that wrap note and what happens. Well, 3 years went by, and now the wraparound note between Sam the seller and Barb the buyer had a balance of $57,071. She still owed 210 payments. Sam the seller still owed Wells Fargo $40,497. He had 136 months left there. We were able to negotiate, the member was able to negotiate to pay $50,000 to purchase that $57,000 note. So if you pay $50,000 for the wraparound note of $57,000, you have to deduct the bank loan payoff of $40,497. So $50,000 gets paid to buy the wrap note from Sam the seller by a note investor like myself. Out of proceeds, we'll pay off the $40,497 balance to Wells Fargo, and Sam the seller will walk with basically what his equity was, $9,502. Of course, the note was a little bit discounted, but remember, Sam the seller also collected payments for all those years, and Sam the seller also collected the down payment. So that's option 1. That pays off Wells Fargo. It's not on Sam the seller's credit. Barb the buyer is super happy because she doesn't have to worry about a due on sale clause anymore. So is Sam the seller. That's option 1. Option 2, and the net option, because the note buyer bought a 9.5 note for $50,000, that note investor yielded 11.66%. So they actually yielded more than the note rate because they bought it at a discount. And we use something called T-value, or you can use a financial calculator just to run those numbers to show you how that payment stream of $559.28 for 210 months, that's the wrap note term. How, if you pay $50,000 for that, you get an 11.66 yield. Now, option 2 is to keep it as a wrap. This does not pay off the underlying first, but it's a way to buy the note and not have to front load so much. So if the note is worth $50,000 and I keep the wrap, I keep the first in place, I'm going to net the difference between the wrap note and the underlying bank loan for the first 136 months of $135.98. And then I'm going to get to collect the whole payment of $559.28. So the note seller is still going to receive that $9,502.39, but I only have to front as a note investor $9,502.39, because when Barb the buyer makes her payment of $559.28, we're going to continue to send off $423.30 to the bank loan. That's why I only get $135.98 as the note investor. I'm just stepping into Sam the seller's shoes. So the cool thing as note investors, when we do it like that, our yield actually goes up because we're controlling the same cash flow with less upfront. I don't have to fund the whole 50,000 to pay off Wells Fargo and to pay Sam the seller, right? I just confront the amount for Sam the seller's equity. And when I do that and leave the Wells Fargo bank loan in place and keep it there, as a note investor, my yield goes up because it goes up to 20.5% from 11.66 because I'm controlling the same cash flow with less upfront money. So just kind of think about it. I always like to throw in these examples to just kind of give you a little thought process of how things can work differently. So I'm going to talk a few more things that I've got coming up, and then I'm going to answer all your questions and let you know how to get copies of any of this if you want. So my wrap up of It's a Wrap is to know the risks. I just touched the surface, but I think you've got a clear picture of what the true risks are. Assess your tolerance. I am not here to say wraps are for everybody. So if you don't understand them, you don't like them, that's okay. There's lots of other ways to make money in real estate and to make money as a note investor on either side of that cash register. But just know when people are out there talking about these, this is why. And there is a unique opportunity right now with all that low interest rate debt and a higher interest rate mortgage environment. Always work with the legal team. Don't try to do this with create your own paperwork. I know it costs a little bit more to involve an attorney, but the good news is these are usually more profitable transactions, so you can afford to pay them out of that. Always be reliable and fair, whether you are Sam the seller or Barb the buyer or the note investor. Be fair, be reliable, and make sure everybody's interests are protected. And be creative, because we just touch the surface of some of the great things you can do with seller financing and creative financing. If things like this interest you, my husband and I put on every year Cash Flow Expo. And it's 4 days where people come in and give sessions just like that are informative. There's no selling. So we have 4 days and we have over 30 speakers. And we talk about current trends that are happening both to buy real estate, sell real estate, rent real estate, wholesale real estate, finance real estate, be a note investor, use seller financing. And there's an attorney that'll be giving a presentation for free. I haven't mentioned that it was for free. About the 3 deadly sins of a subject to. There'll be another investor who talked about how they built a portfolio of 90 notes in their retirement account by doing small seconds. I'll be talking about partials, how you can do partial note purchases. There'll be somebody, Dan Z, who, no relation to me, Tracy Z, but Dan Z, he will be talking about how he's used seller financing to do over 500 deals as a buyer. We'll have another gentleman who's done over 1,000 seller finance deals in Texas. So we have some really top-notch speakers. And so we invite you to go to cashflowexpo.com and sign up, and you will be able to watch those sessions free live. And if you want the recordings, that's where there's a small charge, but you can actually watch the sessions live for free. And so we appreciate that Real Estate IQ allowed us to share that information. If you want additional information of what I talked about today, noteinvestor.com is my website /101. We have some free ebooks on note investing. Cashflowexpo.com is what I already talked about, that free online event that talks about all these great creative financing strategies. And if you have special questions, you can reach out to me at tracy@noteinvestor.com. So I'll leave that on the screen for a second, and I will see what kind of questions that came in. I love it. Okay. Quinn asked, can I get a copy of the presentation? If you would like a copy, I will give you a PDF. You just need to email me, tracy@noteinvestor.com. And then I'll say, will you please also do me the favor of signing up for cashflowexpo.com for free at the same time. So hell, this is exactly what we tell all wrap lenders, to be paid at least a month ahead. Yay! I am so glad that you agree with that, and I appreciate you saying that. Yes. Oh, it's always stay. If this deal is so skinny you can't afford to front one payment on that underlying, please don't do the deal. There's not enough profit in it. All right, and you're just not being fair to all the parties involved. Cece said, actually, option 2 is definitely better. So where we talked about buying the note, whether option one, we paid off the underlying out of proceeds, option two, we left it as a wrap, is since it's the same cash flow. Yeah, you're right. It's not quite the same total if you consider the time value of that 50K. That is correct. So Cece, you're very astute, because this investor that I was working with, I said, oh, if you kept it as a wrap, you could up your yield to that over 20%. And they're like, you know what? I'm putting this in my self-directed retirement account. And I've got money sitting there that's not yield, it's not getting anything. It's getting a measly amount sitting there in that money market fund. So I would rather go ahead and fund the whole 50,000 and get that 11.66 on the whole 50,000 than use 9,500 and get a higher 20% yield on it, because I've got this money on the sidelines and I want to get it deployed. And Tracy, I'm one of those investors that likes to sleep at night, and I don't want to worry if the bank loan is going to someday call due. Yeah, I know I can fund the amount to bring it current. I know that. I know I can sell the note to bring it current, but it's just easier for me to not worry about it. So that investor went with option one. But somebody who's getting started out maybe doesn't have as much upfront cash. Option two is a way to control a lot with a little. It's kind of like people like to do options on real estate because they can control a lot with a little. So I don't know if there's a right or wrong. It's what's best for your circumstances. And of course, what the seller's trying to achieve. If Sam, the seller, is selling the note because he wants to pay off the Wells Fargo, then I ask that, because then of course I need to structure my deal so I know when I buy that note, I can pay off that underlying. So really great questions. I really appreciate that everybody joined me here today. If you've got any follow-up questions, you've got my email, tracy@noteinvestor.com. And I just want to thank all of you for spending a little bit of time with me today. If you have certain questions, I always love them because it helps me fine-tune how the presentation might go in the future. And I will say, have a great time at the Cashflow Expo. Have a great rest of your day. And I will turn it back over to the folks at Real Estate IQ. Thank you. Thanks for attending today. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Tracy. It was wonderful. Thank you for sharing your expertise. And thank you, everyone, for attending. We expect you in future webinars. And we hope you have a wonderful week.
Thank you. Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.